Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Well, it's raining again. Or still.
Rain, go away.
Yeah, let me tell you, man, this spring's weather has been insane. We had our tree planting program, and it was beautiful and sunny 10 minutes before, and then right as we got started, we got sleet and freezing rain and high winds, and I was so frustrated. That's just spring for you this year. It has been a roller coaster.
Well, April, yeah, just... They were counting the days that it's rained around here in April, and it's astounding. It's just every day, maybe one day we didn't have rain so far.
Yeah.
And we're at the halfway point, past the halfway point?
And it may not be much rain, a sprinkle here, a shower there, but it's been so consistent and nonstop that our fields have not had time to dry out. And so we have a lot of mud right now. And so that's what we're going to talk about today.
Mud. That's right. Mud it can be such a nightmare with livestock, such a different way to manage. And unfortunately, with mud comes waste.
Oh, yeah. And in waste, you're meaning a lot of different things, right? Because you've got the waste that comes out of the cattle or the livestock in general.
I wasn't even going there, but you're right. There's that kind of waste
But
too.
that gets mixed into the mud, and if the hay is on the mud, then your cattle end up picking up more of that waste in their food. They're going to eat less, and you're also going to have more of a potential disease and parasite problem.
Yeah, waste of time and unnecessary management. Well, no, not unnecessary. Unplanned management.
Unplanned, yeah.
And a waste of energy for the livestock, depending on how deep that mud is. It's just,
That's right.
Just a waste, right?
Yeah, because they're going to need more calories to get through that. Having to stomp through mud. I mean, you've walked through deep mud. You know how rough it is. Your feet stick in it. It makes you feel miserable, and it's harder to move around. And so your animals, which weigh a lot more than you do, are sinking even deeper in the mud. And they also have a smaller footprint. And so they're just sloshing around in there. And yes, I love that word, slosh. But it takes up a lot of extra energy.
Yeah, and we actually have numbers tied to that. There was actually some there was some older research from back in 1971 even, where they were looking at 30%. I've read papers as far as 40% more energy requirement to maintain just maintenance levels in the livestock. So maintenance levels means that the cow's not gaining or losing. But if you think about it, anytime you increase the energy needs of that animal, the more we exercise, the more we lose weight, the more the animals lose weight. So having to trudge through that mud, having that lower quality feed, hopefully not poor quality water, because that's going to affect it as well. You start losing that body condition. You start spending a lot more money to maintain those animals. And we're not even going to talk about the diseases associated with the mud.
Well, let's talk about one disease associated with mud, because we have a lot of farms who have new calves on the ground. And so one of the most common issues with calves in muddy weather is scours.
Oh, yeah. Scours, the wonderful calf diarrhea.
Mm-hmm. And let me tell you, man, it's just like humans. If one kid gets it, they all get it. And so what do you have to do? You have to move them to a clean, dry location. And that is the easiest way to keep your calves from getting scours or spreading scours to all the other calves.
Yeah.
So if you have calves that came out 2-4 weeks ago, and you still have some mamas that are expecting, get them to a new pasture, get them to a new place that's dry, that the calves have not been to. And that way, whenever she has her calf or calves, those calves are going to have a much higher protection rate because the bacterial load is going to be much lower.
Yeah, and scours is considered to be a disease complex.
Yes.
So the most typical scour pathogen is E. coli, like you were saying, bacterial, but it's also viral and protozoan, excuse me, which means that it's kind of the microflora of the area. So scours, it's a disease complex. It comes from all kinds of pathogens, and with pathogens like water, that's the one thing they have in common. For them to really be infectious and cause harm, they need water. So having that mud, that standing water, just breeds all those different pathogens. And a small calf, can weigh 100 pounds or even less. So if that calf gets infected, so that's a serious thing. You really got to act quickly because it doesn't take long for that little calf to dehydrate itself. A cow's 1,300 pounds, a calf is 100. So if you're not paying close attention, you might lose that calf quickly. And because it's that complex of pathogens, the best way to prevent scours is to make sure that calf starts nursing. That initial colostrum that comes out of the cow when that calf is born is going to have a lot of the antibodies necessary for the microflora in the area. And because it's that disease complex, that's going to give it its first wall of defense for that disease, especially in the mud.
Yeah, and that colostrum, the first 24 to 48 hours of nursing is the most critical time. And that's why it's important. And some of you farmers might have to call off work sometimes to get that calf nursing, to get that mama to welcome that calf if she's first time, and make sure that you get that colostrum in. If the mother isn't nursing, doesn't want the calf, you've got to get a colostrum supplement. So having some on hand before you start the calving season. Now, granted, we're a little too late for that now, but having some of that on hand is a good idea. Some of the powdered colostrum or frozen, but you should also have on hand some electrolytes so that if you do have a calf that does have scours, you can get those fluids back into the animal more quickly. And a lot of times, if you can treat with electrolytes early on and keep the calf from getting dehydrated, that natural immunity that the mother is passing to the animal will help them overcome scours without getting any antibiotics or anything like that. So it's really critical.
That's true, Karen, but I still think it's a good idea to treat with antibiotics as well.
Well, you got to talk to the vet, right? It depends on what the vet recommends.
You're right, but it's a typical recommendation to treat with antibiotics after having scours and just putting those fluids back into the calf, because the calf's still sick. And just like, if you think about food poisoning, you might get all the electrolytes you need, but you still have to get a dose of antibiotics to kind of get over it. A lot of times. You're right, though. This is a vet consultation talk, but subsequent treatment might be necessary.
Yes. And I'm a very strong proponent of making sure you've got a good relationship with your vet and you can give them a call and just ask for their advice, And they'll be like, yeah, you should definitely give them this, that, and the other thing. Or no, hold off for a little while and keep doing this. It's like going to the doctor for you. They're the expert. They have that background. They've looked into a lot of different perspectives and situations. Treatment is also situational depending on your farm, how many animals you have, how close they are together. There are a lot of things. And if you can't control something environmentally, there are other steps that can be taken. So always recommend that vet relationship.
Yeah, and scours is another way that we're talking about mud and waste, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It's just resources and time, and if you lose that calf, that is one of the largest wastes that can possibly happen.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So yes, mud and waste.
So making sure mama is healthy at this time, she's at one of her highest nutrient needs. And so making sure she has access to good, clean, and dry hay. And of course, not getting them out in the pastures too early if you have a heavy clover load, but also just, making sure that mama has access to clean, fresh water, because it will dehydrate her really quick too if the calf is nursing extra because it needs more fluids.
Yeah, and that's one of the main reasons we always talk about stockpiling. And then, stockpiling, the first thing you go to is increasing the grazing season, winter feed, et cetera, et cetera. But then a lot of guys are like, that's my calving pasture, stockpiled grass.
Yep.
It takes that whole scenario away when the ground is dry. And even if that calf doesn't receive the colostrum, you don't have that mud, you don't have that wet threat to your calf.
Right. And, this goes for ewes and lambs too. When a ewe is nursing, she's much more susceptible to a parasitic load. And when you have a wet field, your parasites are going to be more active. And so if can wean your lambs in a dry lot setting, those lambs will then be more protected than if they're in a wetter environment. And so making sure that you have a nice dry location for your young to frolic about, that's going to be that's going to go a long way to helping to maintain the health of your new babies.
So now let's talk about the mama cow. So we did say that mud increases the energy maintenance by 30%, especially a wet, dirty cow.
Mm-hmm.
Now, compound that with mud decreasing feed intake by 15 to 30%.
It's pretty high.
Well, we talk about feeding pads, right? Area feeding it's not mud, it's not forage, it's solid. You can feed dry hay on it. Water doesn't accumulate. It doesn't create mud. It doesn't bring disease. It doesn't accumulate in your livestock. But those if you look at how much it costs to put a feeding pad in, especially if you have an area that you always feed dry hay, especially kind of during this winter, spring transition time, and you get that mud, the feeding pad will eliminate that mud. And if you want to start putting numbers to it, 30% increase in energy maintenance with an additional 30% decrease in feed intake, according to studies, a lot of times you multiply that by a few years and that could justify a feeding pad right there. Furthermore, you could potentially lose a calf due to the disease that we just talked about.
Yeah. One of the things that you can do, and it may be too late now, is like Dan was saying, have that stockpiled field, but also spread out your winter feeding. So if you don't have a winter feeding pad where you can feed them under cover, spreading out your bales into different pastures can also help because with all the rain that we've had this winter, you don't have to get your front end loader or your tractor out to run through those wet, squishy fields to take a bale out. A lot of damage gets done to the soil when you're taking a heavy load out when the soil is wet. So if you can preset your bales out in September when it's nice and dry, yeah, you're going to lose that little circle of grass, but what you're going to get is a healthier overall area where you're going to be able to have your calves in the spring. So spread your bales out for feeding. So let's say you have a sacrifice paddock and it's been sacrificed, right? It is a complete mud pit right now and you're not happy with it. So when you're looking at a winter feeding area like that, you need to get something on it quick because the longer that soil is exposed, the longer that mud is open, the more likely you're going to lose nutrients and your topsoil, right? Which is the most valuable thing a farmer can have is good quality topsoil. So we want to keep that. So if you are looking at an area that needs to be reforaged or covered with new grasses, what we're recommending is to put about 20 pounds annual ryegrass, 3 pounds Kentucky bluegrass, 2 pounds crabgrass, 2 pounds Ladino clover. That is a typical cool season grass mixture that we are recommending for those winter feeding areas. Now, if you have a rotated winter feeding area where you have spread those bales out and you just need to fill in those little spaces, you're looking at about 10 pounds of orchard grass or 14 pounds of endophyte-free tall fescue or 14 pounds of Enhance's endophyte tall fescue. Another option would be 3 pounds of bluegrass, 8 pounds of red clover, 2 pounds Ladino clover, and 5 pounds of annual ryegrass. So remember that clover seed is really going to help to give you that nitrogen, but you also want to look and see what you have and what you need in that pasture field. So if you have a good clover mix, you can probably go more on the grass side, but if you have a really low clover ratio, you really want to bump up your clovers, especially right now.
And you can always interseed the clover later, incorporate those legumes at a later time.
This is true.
I think when you're trying to bring back a paddock, an area that's just completely a mud hole, one of the things that Karen that you were talking about was using annual rye along with some cool season grass mixtures.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of doing some math in my head, but it was about 50% annual forages. So those annual forages are great because they're annuals. They have very aggressive, especially annual rye, very aggressive germination, very aggressive
Growth rate.
growth rate. Thank you. and what they'll do is they'll stabilize that pasture.
Yep, and that's what you need.
They're not going to maintain persistence, but you gotta clean up that area.
Yeah.
And you can always enter seed things as you go. So you can even harvest some of that annual rye and then plant more legumes and cool season grasses along with it. And what you'll have is a systematic approach to reclaiming that pasture.
Right. And normally we're going to say, well, you should have a soil test and you need to apply your lime, but this is an emergency situation. If you just have a big patch of mud, you've got to get it controlled. You've got to get it covered. Get a soil test after you have gotten it restabilized. So, come summertime, you can put on your lime then. But right now, we don't want you to hold off on planting. We want to get your grasses down. You may need to apply a little bit of nitrogen, but you do what you can afford to do on your farm right now.
Yeah, and honestly, that soil test, it becomes really important when you're putting legumes in there, because if your pH is really low, your grasses might be just fine, but especially at a time now when fertilizer costs are so high,
mm-hmm.
you want legumes around and you want to make sure that you're planting them at a good time. So a few things. One, do that soil test when things are looking good, when you got some cover on there. But if you want those clovers to be successful, your pH has to be above 6. Ideally 6.5, closer to 7 even.
Yeah, 6.5 to 6.8 is usually your ideal for clover.
Yeah, and if your pH is low, it's just not going to do well in that kind of environment.
One of the things that I think confuses a lot of people is they say, well, my clover looks fine, but what you're not seeing is under the soil, the microbes that fix the nitrogen are what aren't fine. They are what need that higher pH level. Yeah, the clover is going to survive, but if you want that ultimate high-end nitrogen fixation, you got to make the bacteria happy.
Right. Yeah. And in turn, you're going to get better clover on top of all that. So
yeah. Oh, yeah.
When you see it, you'll know.
Yeah, and we do want to recommend that when you are purchasing seed, getting certified seed up front is going to save you money in the long run. So get the best seed you can afford, and the newest, freshest seed, especially if you are buying legumes, get fresh seed because the inoculations don't keep, those bacteria can't hang out forever. So they do need to be planted within a year of being inoculated to have the best results.
That's right. And many shows that we've done, Karen, we've talked about the best situation is a situation that works for you with the information you have. So, even though certain times things need to be a little bit more aggressive than others, and a lot of times you have to mitigate a problem before you can bring it back to 100%. You have to set the goals in a way that you can reach them and that they will work for you. So when you're trying to bring back something that's been completely, like a paddock that's been completely just destroyed, think about these things. What's your goal, but what's the best thing for right now? And then systematically set your goals to increase that paddock. And then on top of that, once it's established now, you can set some new goals on how do I maintain it? Think about that feeding pad. If you're having issues this year, for next year, is it something that's really going to save me a lot of time? And if it is, more time could mean that you can do more with your livestock. You could better do management intensive grazing, increase your herd size, increase your stocking rate. Those will increase your profits. Anytime that you're dealing with problems, you're not really increasing the capacity for profit and the herd or your business. So just kind of think about these things. Whenever you're trying to fix a problem, once that gets fixed, try to think about the next goal. And in my eyes, ideally, it would be, how do I keep this from happening again?
Yeah, and not all farms are profit oriented, and we use that word a lot. But when you hear us say profit, I want you to hear sustainable, because a farm that isn't pulling in a profit is not sustainable in the long run. And regardless of how many practices you take on to help keep your fields healthy and your animals healthy, if you're not keeping your bank account healthy, then your farm is going to go into default and you're going to lose it. And then someone else may come in and manage it much more poorly than you. So let's have a sustainable farm, both fiscally and environmentally.
So that's right. And let's think about where we're losing money, because like losing money is also losing feed, which then causes you to maybe graze in an area that you shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
So just, if you just think about something like this, if you have haystacks without a rack, you could be losing up to 22% of that hay if you're just throwing it on the ground. And of course, like we did talk about some strategies of laying out some bales in the wintertime so that you could rotationally graze. That's a great strategy, and that's something that you've thought about. That's a whole different context.
Mm-hmm.
But even along those lines, you're still going to lose 22% by feeding hay without a rack. So just understand these things. And again, you have to manage, right? So you can't have a rack in every single paddock either. Sometimes it makes sense not to have one, but understand where you're losing and mitigate those losses the best you can. That's where you're going to be successful. We talk profit, but we mean successful.
Yeah. So make sure that when you are looking at your farm management, you are doing things with thought and intention. Life gets super busy, things get away from us, and we get into reaction mode. And then we're just focusing on trying to put out fires and keep things alive and just get things done as you can go. There was another podcast I was listening to that I really appreciated, because the gentleman and I wish I remembered who it was, but he said, don't ever become so busy that you can't spend some time to do what you're doing better. And so try not to overload yourself. I know I am super guilty of this. But it really does affect the quality of the work that you do and the quality of your life. So think about what you're doing for your farm. Have a plan. I know here in West Virginia, we just had a whole bunch of people go through a pasture management certification so that they can write a pasture management plan for you to help you maintain your pasture in the highest quality possible based on what you are able and willing to do on your property. So make sure you reach out to people and say, hey, can you do a pasture management plan for me? Or if there's no one in your area that does pasture management plans, then, try to talk to your local extension agent to get some information on pasture management planning. And I'm sure we can find a resource that can help you to build a good pasture management plan for your farm that represents your needs and your livestock and your goals.
Absolutely. And you got to understand too that a lot of those government programs that assist with environmental concerns to improve your grazing, your livestock operation, a lot of those things, I can't think of one that doesn't require a management plan. So you got to have that stuff lined up. And the reason they require one is because by observing, by documenting, that's when you start making improvements. So, and honestly, that's the way you figure out how much money you're losing or how much money you're making, ideally. And that's what we want. You want to be profitable. You want to be environmentally sound and be a great steward of the land, because, Karen, you were absolutely right. Being sustainable is being profitable, because then you're not putting money into fixing anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So understanding how much is overgrazing, what's the best way to manage this field to keep undesirable weeds away from my field. If you start overgrazing, you're bringing in more weeds, which then could bring in toxic weeds, which then leads to vet bills, which leads to calf losses.
Leads to spraying pesticides, which are really expensive.
That's another cost.
And then once you start spraying your broadleaf herbicide, you're also killing off your clover. So you're increasing your nitrogen input needs. And so it's this whole spiral that can be protected by making sure you have a good management plan up front and you're making allowances for the animals to get what they need when they need it without abusing the grasses that are there.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna say this, and it might not be the best thing to say, but examine how much land you have, what type of forages you have, your water quality, and just make sure you're not in a situation where you have too many animals that basically just overtake the capacity of that land. It's a lot easier to decrease the amount of grazing area for animals than it is to get rid of animals.
Yeah.
But it might be necessary, because if you're in a situation where your land can't sustain the amount of animals you have, bringing dry hay to feed animals is one of the highest costs that there is in a cow-calf operation.
Yeah, it is.
Being able to maximize grazing is the most profitable thing you can do. Having to remedy fields every year is really going to cut into that profit. And like you were saying, Karen, it's just not being a good steward of that land. You get runoff, you get contaminated water. Once your water quality goes down, so does rate of gain, so does herd health, many things. So understanding the balance between land capacity and how many animals you can sustain in a given area is critical to good management.
Exactly. That's exactly right, Dan. And, when you're talking about hay expenses, a lot of farms in this area are like, well, I'm just going to grow my own hay and I'm going to take away that expense. But they don't calculate in the expense of producing that hay. And they also don't calculate in the expense of storing that hay and things like that. And so, yes, in this region, we do have to feed hay for some months of the year, but the more you can reduce the time spent feeding hay, the more productive and profitable your farm can be. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.